to the Your Most Interesting Story podcast. My name is Rob, and each episode we hear about and dig into the most interesting thing that's happened to someone in their life. These are first-hand, true stories told by the people who experienced them. In this episode, our guest explains how he went from being a fan to becoming a friend of the critically acclaimed author, Russell Hoban. Let's hear Dave's most interesting story.
I was maybe 12 or 13 years old, and in Peoria...
That's Peoria, Illinois, correct?
Yep, I was born and raised in East Peoria, and then I went to college in Peoria, Illinois. And in Peoria, in those days, there was only one museum, the Lakeview Museum and Planetarium, but they had a little used book table of, beat up old paperbacks. And there was one that I picked up and had this bizarre title, The Lion of Boaz, Jachin, and Jachin Boaz. And on the cover, it had a picture of a man with a telescope and a boy holding a map, and then a lion sort of peering out mysteriously from all this foliage, almost like an Henri Rousseau painting, if you know that painter. And on the back, it compared the author to both J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. And I was sold, because in those days, I was basically commuting between Middle-earth and Narnia in my mind all the time.
Dave just mentioned two of the most beloved fantasy worlds ever created. C.S. Lewis brought us Narnia, a magical land with talking animals and mythical creatures, in his Chronicles of Narnia series. And then there's Middle-earth, the setting for Tolkien's Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, where elves, dwarves, and humans battle for the fate of their world.
So I took the book home, and I read it, and it blew my little 12 or 13-year-old mind. Just turned my head inside out, because really I was too young for it. But there was just something fascinating. It told this sort of magical realist story, but there was a language that was very poetic. There was a comedy to it that was out of left field. And there was a way that it just seemed to be constantly getting at a deeper level of life that was hard to understand and hard to put into words, but which seemed really meaningful. So I read this book, didn't really understand it, but came back to it again and again. And then when I was in high school, in my high school library, I stumbled across a book called Turtle Diary by the same author. And this book was completely different, completely realistic, set in the real world. And I found myself not just reading the book, but copying down lines and sentences from it in my spiral notebook. And I found later on, when I connected with other fans of Russell Hoban, that this was a very common experience among his readers. Turtle Diary was later turned into a film. And I was on a trip to San Francisco in 1987, and I stopped into this wonderful old movie theater they had there. I think it's gone now, called the Red Vic. And the movie was Turtle Diary, and it was like, oh, wow, this is that book I read in high school. So I got fascinated with him all over again. And then a few years later, my first job out of college, my first professional writing job, was at the Sears catalog. And during those years, I stopped into, I think it was like a Crown Books maybe, and they had a stack of remaindered books for $1.99. It's like, oh, here's this guy again, Russell Hoban. And I picked up that book, and it just blew my mind all over again. And once again, very different from the other books I read. So by that point, I was hooked. But the thing about Russ's books in the US is a lot of them were out of print. They were hard to find. I had to really haunt the used bookstores. Every time I'd find one of his books, it would just be like hitting the jackpot. Because pre-internet, you couldn't just go online and order a used book from anywhere in the world. It was a treasure hunt.
In the early 1990s, buying books online was practically unheard of. Amazon didn't exist yet, so finding titles meant scouring individual bookstore websites, if they even had them, over painfully slow connections. Even if you found your book, online security concerns and lengthy shipping times made it a daunting process.
If you went to London, it would have been much easier to find his books because he was living over there and all of his books were being published in the UK, but then he'd have to get a separate deal to get them published in the US. So this brings us up to the beginning of the internet era, 1995. At the beginning of 1995, I had never heard of the World Wide Web. By the end of it, my theater company had our first website, and I was temping at an ad agency where I could get on the computer and, browse the web. The only search engine we had in those days was Alta Vista, but I would spend a lot of time on Alta Vista looking up musicians and authors that I liked, and I suddenly noticed that there was kind of this gap on the internet. I mean, there were various gaps I found. Artists I would look up I couldn't find anything about, but one of them was Russ. I couldn't really find any real information about Russell Hoban, and I thought, that's strange, and I kind of bookmarked that in my mind, and a year or two went by, and I'd just been laid off, and I was at home on severance thinking about what I was going to do next, and I thought, I think I want to learn how to make websites. So I got a hold of my friend Kurt Heinz. He was a fellow writer and poet and performer who had been in some shows with me. Kurt was a really computer literate guy, so he took me under his wing and sat me down and showed me how to do basic HTML coding. And I was looking for a project, and I thought, I think I'll make a website about Russell Hoban. And I mentioned this to Diana Slickman, who was another member of the experimental theater company that I belonged to, the Neo-Futurists. We performed together in our show, Too Much Light Makes the Baby Go Blind.
The Neo-Futurists threw out the rulebook and redefined theater in Chicago back in 1988. Their hit show, Too Much Light Makes the Baby Go Blind, broke all the rules. 30 rapid-fire plays in 60 minutes, with audiences actively shaping the show by shouting out numbers to determine the order of the plays. No pretense, no costumes, just raw, real performers sharing authentic stories from their lives. This innovative format ran for an impressive 28 years, making it one of Chicago's longest-running shows before wrapping up in 2016.
And Diana, it turned out, was a big Russell Hoban fan herself, which that was kind of a real watermark for me because I had never met another Russell Hoban fan. But Diana was one of the smartest and most literate people I knew. So I thought, if Diana is a fan of Russ, and if she thinks it's a good idea for me to make a website about him, that's it, I'm doing it. A really common recurring theme in his work is writer's block. In fact, he wouldn't even say the words writer's block. He called it Blighter's Rock, and he wrote a really funny story about how it was like a rock that you get stranded on, and then you have trouble getting off. And he had various techniques for getting around it. One of his really funny quirks was that he wrote on yellow paper instead of white paper, because he felt that it reduced the blankness of the white sheet of paper and made it less terrifying. In one of his books, the main character discovers the yellow paper, and it helps him write a novel. So, in May of 1998, I started working on the website, and I knew by then about Russ's obsession with yellow paper, so I figured out how to code the background into sort of a tawny yellow-orange color that became a trademark of the website. And by that time, there was still no comprehensive website about Russ like the one I was planning, but there were starting to be like interviews with him popping up, or articles about his books. So I then began to discover that there were all of these books that he'd written that I had never come across in the bookstores, didn't know about, and just by luck, Kurt Heinz happened to be on a trip to London, and I emailed him kind of a shopping list, and I said, can you find this book called Fremder? Can you find this book called Mr. Ringo Clacton's Offer? And Kurt was amazing. He found those books and brought them back to me, which helped me make the website more complete. And as I was building it, I was corresponding with some of the people online who had posted maybe just a one-page thing about Russ, or just mentioned him, written a little, essay about him. So when I got ready to launch it, I emailed all of those people to say, hey, this thing I've been working on, thank you so much for, answering my questions and for your input. And it's live. Go check it out. And I think I sent that out in the morning. I came home from rehearsal and I logged onto my email to just see if anybody had anything to say about the website. And I saw the name Russell Hoban, not in the subject line, but in the from field. And I kind of had a little heart attack. I shouldn't have been completely unprepared for this because I knew other people had talked about him getting in touch and thanking them for things, but it was so fast. My heart was just beating, and I got up before I opened the email, and I walked around the dining room table where my Mac was set up 2 or 3 times to try to calm down a little bit before I opened the email. And this has to be the best email I ever got in my life. The subject just said, "Hi. Dear Dave All, hello, Russ Hoban here. Evelyn Leeper sent me an email directing me to your website, and I'm greatly impressed by it. A warning, however, don't stand too close to me or you'll vanish into obscurity. My book sales are very small. I have a hardcore paperback readership of 50 people, each of whom lends his or her copy to 500 friends. Hardback sales also total 50. These are bought by academic libraries and borrowed by people who write about writing. As someone in a Sholem Aleichem story said, if I were in the hat business, people would be born without heads. Nonetheless, I persevere, an old man crazy about words." And from there, he went on to give me the scoop, the dish, and the dirt on several projects that he had in the pipeline so that I had breaking news to put up on the news page of the website. And then he closed with more news as it happens, best wishes, and thanks for the publicity. I'll stay in touch. Russ Hoban. P.S. Send me your postal address and fax number if you've got one. And then, 2 minutes after that, there's another email with the subject line PPS, and it just says, "Who are you and what do you do? Also, where are you?" Somebody said, I wish I could remember who, but the way to any writer's heart is to praise their least popular work. Because if you're a writer, all your books are like children to you. And, the ones that are stars, you've heard all these great things about them, but if you start talking to them about the one that is neglected and overlooked. So I, of course, did that on the website, and he immediately kind of took me under his wing. We started emailing back and forth. It was like having this wonderful, brilliant, eccentric uncle that real life had not granted me. He started sending me news to update the site with. He would have comments or suggestions. We talked on the phone a few times. We would talk about his forthcoming books and whatever he was working on. We'd talk a little bit about the creative process. He was always very encouraging to me about my own writing, which is great to be getting writing advice from one of your favorite writers. He'd talk about what he was reading, and then I'd hang up the phone and I'd just be kind of in a daze. Even after this had been going on for more than a decade, it was like, if your phone rang and it was J.D. Salinger or Harlan Ellison or Ursula K. Le Guin or any other writer you were obsessed with in high school, it was the same to me. Even though he wrote these wonderful, brilliant, critically acclaimed novels for grown-ups, in the United States, most people, if they have heard of Russell Hoban, it's because of his children's books. And his most famous character is a little girl badger named Frances. People just love those books. And over the course of the 60s, this is fun, he was actually an advertising copywriter at a New York ad agency during the Don Draper Mad Men era, 1965 to 67.
Mad Men is a period TV drama that dives deep into the glamorous and cutthroat world of advertising on Madison Avenue in the 1960s. The show revolves around the Sterling Cooper ad agency and its employees, most notably the enigmatic and talented creative director Don Draper. It's known for its stylish visuals, complex characters, and sharp writing, offering a glimpse into a transformative era in American history.
Obviously, as clever as he was, he did well. But over the course of the 60s, his children's books became successful enough that he was able to quit the advertising racket and move to England and just focus on writing his novels. He was writing novels that got rave reviews in the New York Times and everywhere else. These smart, critically acclaimed, beautiful novels. They didn't sell on a huge scale, and they would go in and out of print, even though some of them were just flat-out masterpieces. And it was kind of a sticking point, I think, to Russ that he would get, referred to in the press as a children's author. The next thing we got to was him, if I could fly over to London, inviting me over to have dinner with him. About a year after I launched the website, I flew to London, and along with me as my traveling companion was Kurt Heinz, my fellow performer and collaborator who had taught me how to build the website, because he was pretty interested in the whole story by this time, and he was a seasoned traveler, so it was great to have him along. And Kurt and I flew over there, and we met up with a guy named Olaf, who was one of the first people who got in touch with me after I launched the website, huge Russ fan from Germany. And the three of us went over to Russ's place and had dinner with him and his wife Gundel. And it was another one of those, am I really awake right now sort of moments. I remember that just immediately he, and also Gundel, because she was an incredible hostess, just put us at ease. The food was amazing. Gundel had made a baked eggplant dish because she knew I was a vegetarian. But I didn't know that in the UK they call an eggplant an aubergine. And it was towards the end of the meal when she said, "Why haven't you tried the aubergine?" I had to admit, I didn't know if it was vegetarian or not.
The plant known as eggplant in the U.S. goes by many names worldwide. Aubergine, the preferred term in the UK and elsewhere, boasts older roots, tracing back through French and Arabic to an ancient Sanskrit word. The term eggplant emerged later in the 18th century, inspired by the white, egg-like appearance of some varieties.
I got back, and the other thing that was going on was that this international network of Hoban fans was starting to spring up. One of the best things I did on the website is I created a little guest book where people could leave messages. And Russ's birthday, February 4th, as we got closer to that, I thought, Russ obviously and understandably feels underappreciated. Why don't I get all these people around the world to write up little birthday messages to him? And I put them all into one big email, and I sent it to him on his birthday. And it was probably the one time in my life when I think he was just speechless. His email that came back to me said, "Can't think of anything clever to say." So what happened after that is we all started to get to know each other, as I thought, let me create an online community. And one of the first things we started doing was, for subsequent birthdays, we'd all chip in to buy Russ a bottle of scotch. And then one of the members who lived in London would take it over to Russ and knock on his door and deliver it. Russ eventually, for a while, joined the online community himself, so we got to email back and forth with him. When 2002 rolled around, we all kind of wanted to take things up a notch. We were all feeling like, okay, we know how great his books are, but a lot of them are still out of print. How can we get more attention for Russ? And Diana Slickman, the one who had given me the initial encouragement to build the website, she had this wonderful idea. what if on February 4th, Russell Hoban Day, his birthday, we all take yellow sheets of paper like he writes on, and we write favorite quotations from his books, and then just discreetly leave it in a public place. Like you might leave it on a table at a cafe, or put it up on a bulletin board at a library. I used to like to slip quotations in between boxes of frozen food in the freezer case at the supermarket. People were doing this in Chicago, London, Wellington, New Zealand. In fact, for a while, we had a map of the world that showed all the places. We called this event the SA4QE, which stood for Slickman A4 Quotation Event. A4 being the size of the yellow paper.
A4 is the globally recognized standard paper size used in most countries except for the US and Canada. Measuring 210 by 297 millimeters, or 8.27 by 11.69 inches, it's part of the ISO 216 standard, designed for efficient paper usage and scaling.
I came up with this stupid name, this string of numbers and letters, which I think probably didn't help the event because it was too hard to remember. But the point is, we did this like little guerrilla PR quote disseminators. And eventually, it did get him some press. We realized that his 80th birthday was coming up in February of 2005. And we thought, okay, we really want to pull out all the stops for this. By this time, there was a really smart, bright, and crucially very energetic guy named Richard Cooper. A lot of what has happened over the years couldn't have happened without Richard's work and dedication, and he was one of the prime movers behind the convention. We flew in from all over the world. We went on a group trip to the British Museum to see some works of art that Russ had mentioned in his books. We had a big group dinner where we got up and read things from Russ's books. And then the centerpiece of it all was Russ did a reading at a bookstore in London that we all attended. We had t-shirts, buttons. It was Hoban Palooza.
What was his reaction to all of this? That would be kind of mind-blowing to have a self-organized fan convention.
He just ate it with a spoon. He loved it. I think it was the validation that he had needed for a long time. I think he was also very happy to discover that his fans were people he liked. And I think not every writer gets that. I'd spent so much time in different online communities. I coined the term wavelengthiness, which is just because you and someone else are fans of a band or a writer doesn't necessarily mean you're on the same wavelength about things. So the wavelengthiness of the community was something that I think Russ appreciated along with the rest of us, and is part of what created such bonds between us. So after the convention, I continued on with the website. Eventually, I launched a Facebook page, and I would get those phone calls from Russ, or he'd send me something in the mail. I just have such nice memories of that period of time. But Russ, he was always in poor health. In fact, when I first got to know him, he had me convinced he was going to be gone within a year or two. He was already in his, mid-70s when I met him, 80 in 2005. So in 2011, he was hospitalized, but he had been such a tank, and he had survived for so long that somehow I think in my brain I'd gotten lulled into thinking, Russ is going to live to be 100. To me, he was an idea that couldn't die. I didn't really worry about it as much as, in retrospect, I should have. I was not prepared when suddenly I got the message that he had passed away. A year or two after that, I was invited to contribute a biography of Russ to the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, which is this venerable compendium with a long history of biographies of people who were important figures in British history. And I still don't even know how they found their way to me. I guess they just must have found the website and thought, wow, this guy seems to know a lot about Russell Hoban, and knew him personally. So I spent probably close to a year working on that. I wanted to do it right. The Yahoo group that we used to have to communicate with, unfortunately, got purged from the internet. It was a very sad thing. But fortunately, there was the Russell Hoban Facebook page, and I was connected to a lot of folks on Facebook or other social media platforms. So we continued to do the SA4QE every February 4th. But I think maybe as long as a couple years ago, we kind of realized, hey, 2025 is going to be the 100th anniversary of Russell Hoban's birth. So I set up a new online group and kind of went around getting the band back together, getting everybody to join the group. And for the last couple of months, we've all been actively planning ways to celebrate what we're calling Hoban 100. We're still finalizing details. There is, I'm pretty sure, going to be a live performance in Chicago. It's going to be Diana Slickman and me and a couple of other people doing readings from Russ's books. And I think there's going to be some sort of a meetup in London. And then hopefully we're also going to do some online Zoom type events. And there might be some kind of a publication that's produced. But none of this is nailed down just yet. By the time this podcast airs, though, probably it will be, and probably it'll be easy to find information by doing a web search for Hoban 100, Hoban 100, and that'll be the hashtag too.
What do you think he would say if he knew you were celebrating the 100th anniversary of his birth?
He'd be thrilled. He got such a kick out of being appreciated, and it was one of the things I loved about knowing him, being able to deliver that to him and let him know that, hey, maybe some of your books are out of print, you're not getting as much attention as, say, Stephen King is, but there are people around the world reading and rereading your books and copying down lines from them. As a writer who has toiled in semi-obscurity myself, I often feel like if you write your heart out and you're true to your muse, you are not promised fame or fortune or celebrity. The reward that you're most likely to get if you do it right is just that at some point somebody will say to you, hey, that thing you wrote, it saved my life. It really meant a lot to me. It made me cry, or it's so funny, I think of it all the time. And maybe it's 5 people who say that, maybe it's 50, maybe it's 100, maybe it's 1 million if you're a best-selling author, but the number almost doesn't matter. It goes back to that idea of wavelengthiness. Some of us are on wavelengths that not many other people are on, but that doesn't mean it's not a good wavelength, and it makes it all the more meaningful when you can connect with other people who are on that wavelength, and when you find a writer who speaks to you on that wavelength, who can put things into words that are really important and really meaningful and nobody else has really been able to express. And Russ was that kind of writer. He's not someone whose writing you could really mistake for anyone else's. And if his work vanished from the libraries of the world would be diminished by the loss of a particularly unique voice.
And that's going to bring Dave's story to an end. To find out more about Russell Hoban's centenary and the Hoban 100 event, visit russellhoban.org. You can find out more about Dave and his work by visiting his Linktree I'll include the link in the episode description. Remember that you can visit YMIS Podcast on Instagram for pics related to this and every episode. We are also on Blue Sky at YMIS Podcast. Your Most Interesting Story is available on all podcast platforms, including YouTube. With 1 year under our belt, and if you like what we're doing, we would absolutely love it if you shared the podcast with someone you think would enjoy it. And if you want us to tell your most interesting story, follow the link to our website in the show description. Until next time, be interesting.
There's a linguistic term for that process of turning vowels into schwas.
I'm going to have to do a cutaway now about schwas.
I was going to say, I had never heard of such a thing, and I was having real trouble following.
Wait, are you serious? You guys don't know what a schwa is?
No, I know what a schwa is.
The truth about schwas.
Had a nice dinner with Russ.
Is that the time you thought haggis was a plant?
No, fortunately I was warned about haggis early.
I thought that was a tongue depressor holster you had on your wall.
I don't even want to say what I think it looks like.